Undercounted COVID deaths. The CDC's contradictory pneumonia and influenza death numbers. April 14th, 2020. This is an overview of what I'm going to talk about. I have two main topics. The first is that the CDC's weekly pneumonia and influenza death numbers for 2020 are less than comparable weeks last year, 2019, as of March 28th, 2020. So these are numbers that were posted on Friday, April 10th, 2020. There is absolutely no sign of COVID-19 until March 14th of 2020. There has been some increase in the last 2 weeks, but the numbers are still less than last year's pneumonia and influenza weekly deaths for comparable weeks. Considering all the problems with testing and asymptomatic carriers, it would be surprising that there are no COVID-19 deaths which are misclassified as pneumonia and influenza. They're not to be seen, and I'll discuss this in detail. The weekly numbers, if you sum them up over a year, show that over 180,000 people die from pneumonia and influenza each year, over 3 times the widely cited 55,000 number from the leading causes of death. This raises a lot of questions about how these numbers are collected and tabulated and how reliable they are. There was a seeming cover-up by the Chinese government of the coronavirus outbreak in December of 2019. People were muzzled, people were threatened. The Chinese government didn't seem to respond until January. Therefore, there were several weeks where the disease probably spread unchecked and unnoticed. 430,000 people have traveled from China to the United States since the coronavirus surfaced. The United States badly bungled the coronavirus testing. So the World Health Organization recommended a working test from Germany, which the U.S. turned down. The CDC apparently decided to make its own test rather than use one already in existence. That took several weeks. Then they sent out their test and it failed. There was something wrong with a critical reagent. At least that's the explanation that's given. So the United States still does not have a lot of tests, and the situation was very few tests available in February that were reliable. This is not unusual with even extremely deadly diseases like the Black Death in the Middle Ages. Many people are asymptomatic or nearly asymptomatic. Maybe they have a brief sniffle or something like that. They don't get sick. The virus may in some cases establish a benign parasitic relationship with its host, or perhaps there's some kind of symbiosis we don't understand. Regardless, this means many people can travel and spread the disease without being aware of it, without being detected by the authorities or any tests. They don't run a temperature, they don't show anything, particularly in the absence of a comprehensive testing regime. Studies have reported that about 86% of the cases in Wuhan were not detected. Given that, we would expect to see a surge in pneumonia and influenza deaths as the coronavirus spreads through the country without tests, with limited awareness of the problem and so forth, and all of the things I've mentioned. However, this is not visible at all until March 14th, using the latest data from the CDC, which was posted on April 10th, Friday, this past Friday. As of March 28th, there were 1,900 official COVID-19 deaths. Remarkably, all of the numbers up to March 28th, including an increase which was within the range of fluctuations of these numbers, all of these numbers are actually lower than the comparable week last year. So if you look at my chart here, on the horizontal axis, we have the week of the year. 1 is the first week of January, and 13 is the week that ends March 28th in 2020. The red is the number of deaths that week in the weekly pneumonia numbers in 2020. The blue is this year. It's consistently lower, and in fact, if you integrate it and you measure the difference, there's about 6,000 fewer deaths this year than in the corresponding period, weeks 1 through week 13 last year. That's very remarkable if extremely deadly disease like COVID-19 is spreading through the country during this period. It's hard to believe, too good to be true. One possible explanation is that these numbers are incomplete, and even deaths that occurred, say, in January have not been, for some reason, forwarded to the National Center for Health Statistics. It's hard to determine if that's true. It's certainly a possible explanation. On the Associated FluView website, we find a table that appears to have been put up in the last few weeks, although it might have been there earlier, but I don't remember seeing it. A table which seems to show the percent completeness of these numbers. So for example, for the selected week, week 13, which is the most recent week in the data, percent complete is 93.3%. For weeks 12 and 11, we see something that is a bit strange, greater than 100%, greater than 100% for both weeks 11 and 12. 100% is complete, so why would you put in a greater than sign? What is greater than 100%? Naturally, one would look at this question mark to see if one could find out how percent complete is defined. In fact, if you click on it or hover over it, you will get a legal disclaimer that says the numbers are subject to change, which of course contradicts with greater than 100%. That doesn't give one a warm, fuzzy feeling. So before I go to the next slide, let me just restate the situation here. Remarkably, there's very little sign of COVID-19 in the weekly pneumonia and influenza deaths. In fact, no sign whatsoever up until March 14th, and a slight increase the last couple of weeks. Furthermore, all of the deaths this year are lower than the corresponding weeks last year. And in fact, the 6,000 difference could mean is actually larger than the 1,900 official deaths on March 28th. And therefore, these could all be due to a high false positive rate in the coronavirus test. So if it had a high false positive rate, you could easily be labeling some of these pneumonia and influenza deaths as coronavirus deaths. There's no numerical problem here. There were plenty of deaths last year that are not here this year. So let's try to understand what percent complete might mean. It doesn't really say, it just has a legal disclaimer. I found sort of third-hand information, supposedly from a researcher with some connection to the CDC. And what he is quoted as saying is, as per the meaning of percent completeness in FluView is calculated based on the average number of deaths per week using data from the past 3 years and doesn't take seasonality into account. So what that means is this number is just an average from previous years when there was no crisis, no panic, no chaos. It is not a recent real-time count of how well they're doing collecting the death certificates. So if that's true, those numbers in the percent complete column are probably meaningless and don't answer the question of how reliable these numbers are. What are the possible reasons for this deficit, this low number of deaths this year, despite a supposedly highly contagious and highly deadly disease spreading through the population? Well, one possibility is that despite the Chinese cover-up, despite the United States testing fiasco, despite the 430,000 visitors from China since the disease was first detected, and the large number, maybe as much as 80% asymptomatic carriers, the United States has been remarkably effective in finding nearly all COVID-19 fatalities up to March 28, 2020. I personally find that hard to believe. It seems too good to be true, but it cannot be excluded. It could be the actual mortality rate of COVID-19 is much lower than popular numbers. For example, WHO's figure of 3.4%, and the lower number from officials like Tony Fauci of about 1%, that is too high. Currently, the data from Iceland, South Korea, Denmark, and Germany suggest more like 0.5% mortality rate based on wider testing and some random testing or volunteers who are asymptomatic. And again, even their numbers could be high because they're not really doing random population sampling to get actually a good number. Related to that, many COVID-19 deaths are due to aggressive treatment of the disease, for example, intubation, which is very dangerous, rather than the disease alone. So again, if you're diagnosed with pneumonia and influenza, you don't get intubation, you don't get all these panic special procedures, and as a result, you don't die, or as frequently. It could be that the CDC weekly pneumonia and influenza death numbers are undercounting for some reason. Unusual delays due to the crisis, the chaos. We could point especially at overwhelmed areas like New York City and say maybe the data is on their computers or on their desk and has for some reason not been forwarded to the National Center for Health Statistics or some other kind of crisis-related delay. There may have been a compensating drop in non-COVID pneumonia influenza deaths due to shelter in place. And in January and February, high-risk individuals, the elderly, people with medical conditions, taking it easy, being extra cautious, and therefore they don't get the non-COVID pneumonia and influenza, or they don't die from it if they do get it. It could be something else. It could be some combination of some or all of the above. There are reasons to be skeptical of the weekly pneumonia and influenza death numbers on the CDC website. There are remarkably contradictory numbers on the CDC websites and reports. If you sum the weekly pneumonia and influenza death numbers for 2017, for example, they show 180,000 people died from pneumonia. They only show about 8,000, a little bit more actually, died from influenza in 2017. And this is typical of recent years. They're typically reporting at least 3,000 deaths from pneumonia and influenza each week, even in the summer. So the number of deaths is more like 180,000 per year. Well, what's the problem here? This grossly contradicts. It is 3 times the roughly 55,000 deaths from flu or flu-associated illness or influenza and pneumonia that is quoted in the leading causes of death reports. And this is a number you have probably heard on the media and the news just recently as to typical, quote, flu deaths. So here we have these numbers from the 2017, the most recent report available of leading causes of death in 2017. Most important is cause 8, influenza and pneumonia, with only 55,672 deaths to be precise. The fourth cause, chronic lower respiratory diseases, gives 160,201, and that may be relevant. I'll explain that as we go along. Here it is again. I'll zoom in just to be absolutely clear. The leading causes of death report for 2017 gives the number of influenza and pneumonia deaths as 55,672. In common usage, influenza and pneumonia is the same as pneumonia and influenza. But the pneumonia and influenza weekly deaths gives over 180,000, over 3 times this number of deaths in 2017. Why is this? I don't know. There's no clear explanation of the contradiction in the different numbers on the CDC websites. Perhaps it's in an obscure footnote or tucked away somewhere, but it's totally not clear. I do, however, think I probably understand where these different numbers are coming from. So a reasonable theory is the following. Looking at other parts of CDC's website, their reports, published articles, the Centers for Disease Control uses a model to estimate flu-associated deaths. And here is an explanation in detail of at least some of what they're doing. They're answering questions here about their numbers, and they say, why doesn't CDC base its seasonal flu mortality estimates only on death certificates that specifically list influenza? And the weekly numbers appear to be basically the causes of death listed by doctors or coroners on death pathologists, the causes listed on the death certificates. And in fact, influenza is rarely listed for these deaths. It's usually apparently pneumonia. So the CDC makes arguments that there's a massive undercount of influenza, and they have a computer model or a mathematical model of some sort to adjust for this. They give numerous vague explanations for why. There isn't supposedly a single reason. The use of this model has been criticized by various people for at least 15 years who strongly questioned this practice and what they're doing with the numbers. So this is an article from the British Medical Journal, one of the most prestigious medical journals in the world, by Peter Doshi. Its title is "Are U.S. Flu Death Figures More PR Than Science?" And he starts with U.S. data on influenza deaths are a mess and goes on in that vein for several pages. The most critical part is probably about here in his analysis. He says, the NCHS data would be compatible with CDC mortality estimates if about half of the deaths classed by the NCHS as pneumonia were actually flu-initiated secondary pneumonias. But the NCHS criteria indicate otherwise. Cause of death statistics are based solely on the underlying cause of death, defined by WHO as the disease or injury which initiated the train of events leading directly to death. So the point is that if flu was the underlying cause, that should be listed. And he concludes, thus, the much publicized figure of 36,000, this is in 2005, and the number was lower than the 55,000 today. So resuming, the 36,000 is not an estimate of yearly flu deaths as widely reported in both the lay and scientific press, but an estimate generated by a model of flu-associated death. So very likely the influenza and pneumonia number in the leading causes of death report is this estimate or a closely related number in which some fraction of the pneumonia deaths is attributed to an initial flu infection. The CDC gives a number of different excuses for why they inflate the number of flu deaths dramatically from the actual, what appear to be the actual death certificate reports and what's apparently in the weekly pneumonia and influenza deaths. So for example, they say doctors underdiagnose it for some reason. And they claim that the tests for influenza infection need to be run within the first few days of infection, and that often isn't done. And a number of other things. It's very complicated. Well, on some parts of their website, they have a page that says basically comparing a cold or a flu, whatever they mean by a cold. So is it a full cold or flu? Well, this is on the right is a widely distributed graphic that the CDC produced, which seems to indicate that you can distinguish fairly often between a cold and a flu based on symptoms, something a doctor could determine by interviewing a patient without running a test, as well as perhaps examining the patient. So for example, symptom onset, cold is gradual, flu is abrupt. Now they don't give how many hours this means, but it sounds rather different. Flu is supposed to be much more dangerous than the cold, therefore shouldn't it appear different when a doctor examines someone? Fever, it's rare in a cold, usual in a flu. Aches, slight in a cold, usual in a flu, and so on. Headache, for example, at the end, rare in a cold, common in a flu. This would seem to suggest you can tell them apart with a fair accuracy. Undoubtedly, there are false positive and negative rates without conducting a test. However, right next to it in the web page, they have the text that says, because colds and flu share many symptoms, it can be difficult or even impossible to tell the difference between them based on symptoms alone. Special tests that usually must be done within the first few days of illness can tell if a person has the flu. So doctors don't pay special attention to determine that something is the flu because it's supposed to be more dangerous. They don't order tests for high-risk patients, and they can't use the kind of symptoms listed here, like fever and headache, to determine the likelihood that probably this guy has a flu and that person over there has a cold. That's what the CDC seems to be saying on their website. These contradictory numbers, confusing language, and so forth can be understood if the primary goal of this documentation, the website, FluView, etc., is to market the flu vaccine and convince the public to buy it, to use it. If you look at the raw death certificates, what appears to be the weekly numbers, confirmed deaths due to influenza viruses are only 8,000 per year. Only about a quarter of the tests that are actually run on samples actually show the influenza virus present. The general public frequently thinks flu is synonymous with the common cold. They don't really discriminate between them very well. I know this from speaking to highly educated people who've gotten the flu vaccine and then gotten a cold and were baffled because they didn't understand that the flu vaccine is only for influenza. The flu vaccine is at best only effective for actual influenza viruses, which appear rare in the death certificates or weekly numbers or whatever. The use of the model, the estimate, makes flu a leading cause of death with about 55,000 fatalities per year. Even so, non-flu, whatever that is, kills over twice as many people each year. What happened to these other non-flu deaths? One possibility is that they were put into the chronic lower respiratory disease category, the fourth leading cause of death, where about 140,000 of those deaths are listed as other. So they make a big deal out of bronchitis and emphysema, but these are very rare forms of chronic lower respiratory disease. So when you go to FluView or when you go to the weekly statistics page, the main thing that you see first off is a graphic. This is the graphic. This graphic, shown in the red line, shows the percent of all deaths each week due to pneumonia and influenza. If you use the model, so if this is supposed to indicate deaths from the flu attributed to influenza in some way, and you use the model with the 55,000 number per year, instead of it going from 6% to 10%, it would only go from 2 to maybe 3% or a little over 3% in a really bad outbreak, the spike in 2018. On the other hand, if you use the total weekly pneumonia and influenza deaths, you get something that goes from 6% on the low end during the summer up to 8% often and sometimes 10%. So this is scarier. By using all of the pneumonia and influenza numbers, the full 188,000, if you will, over a year, you get a graph with numbers that are scarier and is likely to induce people to get a flu vaccine. These weekly pneumonia and influenza death numbers raise troubling questions about the Centers for Disease Control and its counting and tracking of deaths. Now, in the last couple of weeks, since the virus outbreak, since the shelter-in-place orders, the FluView website in particular has a disclaimer. When you go to it, the first thing you encounter is a pop-up disclaimer, a legal disclaimer. You have to scroll through it and click OK before you can look at this scary figure here with the percentage deaths, which is what most people probably look at. Very few probably download the comma-separated values file with the raw numbers. What the legal disclaimer basically says is the numbers are subject to indefinite change. It doesn't guarantee that they're up to date or 100% complete. Quite the opposite. This raises some question as to why they are published by the CDC each week if they are unreliable, which the disclaimer could indicate. So there are life and death questions here. Is the CDC undercounting COVID-19 deaths classified as pneumonia and influenza? Why is there so little evidence of it so far? This would lead to underestimating the mortality rate of the disease, or it could, and overstating the effectiveness of shelter in place or the precautions that are being taken. On the other hand, all of this could indicate the mortality rate of the disease is overstated. It could also mean an overlapping situation is our aggressive treatments such as intubation contributing to deaths. So without those treatments, people who are just diagnosed with pneumonia and influenza, even if they have the coronavirus, aren't dying in anywhere near the numbers being reported. So this video was made on Tuesday, April 14th, 2020. And I will, as usual, include a professional disclaimer. There's a detailed legal disclaimer on my website. I'm not a medical doctor or anything like that. And if you have medical issues or problems or anything that requires a professional help, legal stuff, etc., you need to speak with a qualified medical, health, or other legal, other professional for any advice, any decisions that you make. The information I present here is for general educational and informational purposes. And you need to talk over anything with respect to your health or that of your family or anyone else with a qualified, doctor, medical professional, etc. So it's my hope that everyone will do well and that we will come through this crisis as well as can be, and that deaths will be minimized. And it's my hope that these numbers will be carefully clarified um, by the Centers for Disease Control and other responsible authorities. That concludes this video. If you like this video, please take a moment to click like. Please click subscribe and the notification bell if you would like to receive more content from us. We welcome constructive feedback and comments. Mathematical software is developing products and services to automate data analysis, reducing the risks of costly errors and improving results. If you want to support our work, you can subscribe on our Patreon page. This is the URL for our Patreon page. Scan the QR code in the lower right corner with your smartphone to get the Patreon link. Our Patreon link is also in the show notes below.